Perfect. Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all all those who are listening and all those who will be watching the video on YouTube. It's wonderful to be a part of this conference. And today's talk is very dear to me. It's based on a paper that's out now in Egypt, the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policy. And it's a paper that will discuss the economics of a good friend of mine, good friend of yours as well, Basil Moore. So I'm going to share my screen. And there you go. And I have to try to make this there you go. What a way to I'm not exactly sure how to make this right here. Yep. Nope. Apologies. I don't seem to be able to.
Slideshow, sir.
I'm just trying to make it big.
In the slideshow?
There you go.
Yes.
Good. Thank you very much. Okay. So today's talk is, so my name, for those who don't know me, Louis-Philippe Rochon. I am a full professor of economics at Laurentian University in Canada. I am the current co-editor of the Review of Political Economy, the founding editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics, and the lead editor of a book series, a new book series by Elgar. This is a 10-book series on central banking and monetary policy. The talk today is on Basil, and if Kaldor is to be considered the father of endogenous money, Basil could be considered certainly its uncle, so to speak. Certainly revived endogenous money very forcefully in the late 70s and early 80s. And Basil certainly is known as the father of the horizontalist view. Of course, endogenous money predates Basil. I'm not talking here about the debates between the banking school and currency school going back a few centuries, but even in the more recent revival, contemporary setting, we have to think about Joan Robinson, whose accumulation of capital I consider to be sort of the first book on post-Keynesian economics. And of course, there are others, Jacques Le Bourgeois in 1962, who was a French banker, and others, but and Kaldor, of course, in the 70s. But Basil really needs to be credited with having revived the concept of endogenous money and having made it really sort of the cornerstone of post-Keynesian economics. I first met Basil, I think it was 1984, at a conference at the University of Ottawa, where I was an undergraduate. I was taking classes with Marc Lavoie, Marius Sicareccia, and Alain Parguez at the time. And they had organized a rather big post-Keynesian conference, and I first met Basil there. And I was familiar mostly at the time with his 1979 paper in Eichner's book, and A Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics. And so I knew a bit about him, and I certainly was very interested in meeting him. And having studied economics with Lavoie and Sicareccia, endogenous money was very much part of what we were learning. So I remember going for very long walks, 2 walks maybe, with Basil, and I was maybe 20 at the time. And he encouraged me very much to continue studying post-Keynesian economics. And in my 1999 book, I wrote, Basil Moore has, of course, played a pivotal role, as he did. Since early on, I found his work both stimulating and rich, and I acknowledge his apparent intellectual influence on my work. And this is, could have been written by a number of young scholars at the time and today as well. Basil influenced quite a number of people. And I visited Basil. I think I was probably the last of the post-Keynesians to have seen him. I visited him in his wonderful house in Stellenbosch, South Africa, just a few months before he passed, or several months before he passed. And I have a few pictures there that I took. And of course, on the left is Basil and his wonderful wife, Sibs. And on the right, beautiful property called Moore's End. And I wrote the obituary for Basil for the Royal Society, Economic Society. And you should check it out. Wonderful memories of Basil that I wrote in there. And the second picture at the bottom, well, that was just my view, the view from my bedroom where I was staying on the property. Just absolutely beautiful. And I remember that evening very well. And well, I keep very fond memories of Basil and Sibs, of course. So, like I said, today's presentation is based on my paper in Egypt, and this was a special issue in honor of Basil that was edited by Mark Setterfield. And Mark has a wonderful introduction. And there are the other papers in there are from Sheila Dow and Giuseppe Fontana, John Smith, and Malcolm Sawyer, and Peter Doherty. And it's a nice little tribute to Basil. I encourage you all to pick it up. Of course, Mark Setterfield also edited a wonderful Festschrift in honor of Basil, in which I have a chapter, and you should consider that reading that as well. Now, Basil, of course, is famous for his book Horizontalists and Verticalists, and which generated quite the controversy within post-Keynesian economics, as you all know. It led to a ferocious debate between the horizontalists and what was called the structuralists. And, to be fair, the debate started a little bit before. Basil had written a few papers in the JPKE on endogenous money, and there was a considerable debate. And these debates led to, the book. I guess the book is, in a way, a result of those early debates, and the book itself was a catalyst for considerably more debates. And I won't deal with that. I won't deal with what Basil said in the book or those debates. I've written extensively on those debates, and in a way, I think they should be considered over. I think that we are all horizontalists now. I mean, there's cannot be any doubt in my mind that we're not horizontalists. And this is a quote by Ulrich, who I published in 2003. And so in the Review of Keynesian Economics, I published three papers in honor of Basil. John King and James Cullum wrote a wonderful paper, as did Ulrich Beinsel. And Ulrich, who's at the ECB, of course, and who concludes, we have all become horizontalists in the last 25 years. That symposium was in honor of the 25th anniversary of the publication of Basil's book. And when Ulrich says we, of course, he means central bankers. And I think this is an important conclusion. Now, if I won't be dealing with the debates or Basil's views in 1988, which I said are fairly well known, what I do want to deal with is the 20 or so years that predates, or 30 years, actually, I miscalculated. The 30 years that predates the publication of Basil's book from 1958 to 1979. And 79 is a very important date because that's when I think that Basil finally understood what endogenous money was all about. 79 refers to his paper in Challenge magazine, which was reprinted in Eichner's book, Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics. And also, Basil has a paper in the JPKE in 1979 as well. So I think that by then, he grasped the essence of endogenous money. And my argument is that was not always the case. Basil comes from, his early roots are rooted in some sort of new Keynesian or Tobin Keynesian roots. And it wasn't very clear to me that actually, it was clear to me that he didn't quite understand endogenous money. So I'm going to go over Basil's own long struggle of escape, one that I don't think he never really fully escaped. Even in his 1988 book, there are some problem passages, but I'm not going to deal with them. I've dealt with them elsewhere. So first, I do want to say what is endogenous money. I don't want, I could give a slide, a show, a presentation on what is endogenous money, but I'm going to follow the definition from my book. And also of note is my paper with Rossi in Roch on the evolutionary and revolutionary views of endogenous money. Clearly, Basil, to this day, I would put in the evolutionary category of endogenous money, very much in the Chickean sense of the evolution of banks and of central banks. And this is clear in the 30 years leading up to the book. Now, in my book, I talk about 5 or 6 characteristics of endogenous money, but 2 which are particularly important here is the idea that banks are never constrained in their lending activities, except for the demand credit-worthy customers. So as long as they are credit-worthy, banks will lend to them. And certainly, banks are not constrained by their deposits or their reserves. So it's the assets that determine the liabilities of the bank's balance sheet. And this is, I think, important to understand Basil's evolution. And this is, like I said, he came around to this view later on. I want to talk about 3 specific phases in Basil's work. The first is the 1958 to 1970, which I call, the neo-Keynesian or the mainstream or the Tobin phase of his work. Then the 1970 to 1977, which began with his sabbatical at Cambridge University, and which I call, to use Basil's own words, his years of awakening. And then the period 1979 to 1988, which are the horizontalist years. 1978-9 marks another sabbatical he took at the Bank of England, where he became friends with Charles Goodhart, and that influence as well. And this is when Basil started understanding clearly endogenous money. But there is nevertheless, despite these 3 phases, a consistency through Basil's 3 phases, which was his opposition to the quantity theory of money, as he explains in an interview with John King, in a wonderful, wonderful interview. This is a book by John where he interviews a bunch of economists. I really recommend this book. But Basil says, he was always uncomfortable with Friedman. He was always critical of Friedman, and that Friedman was the enemy. And so this is consistency. And you can see you can clearly see this even in his very early views um, on money. So the first phase, this is following his PhD. Basil was always interested in banks. Banks always played a very important role. They were always at the center of his analysis. Um, you know, bank lending was done because there were credit worthy customers. And he says here, he says, the role of banks, the proper role of banks, is to accommodate legitimate, non speculative business demand for short term credit. And so he was certainly aware of sort of this credit led principle that he developed much later on. And but in that, in that early period, he contrasts that view with what he calls the portfolio behavior of banks. And it's sort of this portfolio behavior that dominates. I mean, he says that these are not mutually exclusive. But here he says, as long as a legitimate demand for loans is not greater than the available supply of loans by banks. So here, clearly, there's a supply constraint to the lending activities of banks. And in my book in 1999, I call this the credit-led but supply-determined banking model. And so in other words, as long as the demand for credit doesn't is not greater than the available supply, banks can accommodate. But clearly, the supply of these loans is limited. And this is perfectly consistent with Tobin's new view. And there are other instances as well. Certainly, his main publication in this period is an introductory book from 1968, where he sees banks as financial intermediaries. He talks about banks lending out the deposits of their customers. So very fairly conventional stuff. In the Roque paper by Cullum and King, they clearly say, and I agree, there's no hint of endogenous money in his book on the theory of finance, which was influenced by Metzer and Patinkin and James Tobin, you see. So this was sort of Basil's early beginnings, a very conventional beginning. But you see elements that will come back later on in his career, specifically the demand-determined view, the credit worthiness, all of that is there. The only thing that is different is this view of a supply constraint. That starts to change. 1970, Basil is a visiting scholar, senior visitor at the University of Cambridge. And he describes this period as the sun coming out, and with reason. Now, Basil claims that that's when he first publicly tied his flag to the endogenous money pole. I don't think that's correct. I think he's starting to open the door, but he's not quite there yet. But nevertheless, this was a very formative period. But let's get one thing straight. Basil didn't go to Cambridge to study the Cambridge economists or the Cambridge view or the Caldor, the Robinson. Not at all. Basil, and this comes from his current wife, Sibbs. He just loved England. And he had a friend there who I guess was on sabbatical, and he had a free office. And so Basil decided, why not? Went to Cambridge, and also I think to be closer to his first wife, who was in Germany at the time. So he went there for purely personal reasons, nothing very academic. But once at Cambridge, he was at Cambridge. So he immersed himself in Keynes, the general theory, the treatise of money, and these were certainly a formative period. But history has a way of playing dirty tricks on you because when he was at Cambridge, um, his office was in between the office of Joan Robinson and Richard Kahn. And at the time, Paul Davidson was in Kahn's office, and Paul was in Cambridge to write Money in the Real World. So Basil ended up, by sheer coincidence, in between Joan and Paul. And like I say here, did Basil become a post-Keynesian by sheer historical accident? But nevertheless, Paul and Basil developed a very strong friendship. He had numerous conversations with Robinson, who would, leave Basil, and Paul, same thing. She would leave notes on what she had read or ideas that had popped up in her head. And also, Basil didn't have a lot of interaction with Caldor, but did sit in some of his lectures. And 1970 is when Caldor published his paper on endogenous money, I think in the Lloyd's Bank Review. So there was certainly a lot of discussion, and as you can imagine, with Paul on money. And Joan Robinson, as I said, wrote the first sort of authoritative paper on money, or I should say book. The Accumulation of Capital contains a lot of stuff on endogenous money, on the monetary circuit, probably as a result of having read Rosa Luxemburg. But these all these had a tremendous impact on Basil, and you see a lot of references to this. And it's not a great leap of faith. Like I said, in the previous period, he saw banks as important. He was halfway there. So having met Joan and Paul and Caldor, I'm not surprised that these events just pushed him over the edge, so to speak. And here's a couple of quotes by Basil. In an interview he gave to Egypt in 2010, the reason why I became a post-Keynesian was that I became a good friend with Paul Davidson. And I believe that. I believe our numerous discussions in Cambridge, plus lectures by Caldor and Robinson that we attended, finally converted Basil to a more, so this is a quote from Davidson. And I agree with this. This is in an email he sent me, to a more post-Keynesian approach and led him to the concept of endogenous money. I agree. In his book, he writes in the introduction, my greatest intellectual debt is to Paul Davidson. Now, he did have a very strong friendship with Paul, but I'm not sure if Paul's views led him to the endogenous theory. Paul at the time in Money in the Real World, and John King agrees with this position. Paul's view on endogenous money has always been sort of a very tricky one. It's about a shifting LM curve. So not exactly the horizontal curve, but nevertheless, I think there was a lot of seeds that were planted in Basil's mind at the time. Now, he published a paper in the Economic Journal in 1972. And this was a paper that was in the same issue as a paper by Paul Davidson, coincidence. But nevertheless, it was probably written either at Cambridge or shortly after, submitted in very early 71 and published in 72. And so I think it's important. And I think that paper in which he quotes Caldor and Cramp, I think that, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe. Okay. Excuse me. So he quotes Caldor and Cramp, and you know, the paper is very interesting because he talks about um, interest rates and as a control variable, and there's a section there called the endogenous money supply, and in the Cullum and King paper in Roche, I'm not exactly why they conclude that there's no endogenous money in this paper, because there is. There's clearly endogenous money. I think that this is not surprising. I would have been surprised if there had not been after he had spent a year at Cambridge with our protagonists, but there was. And but this view of endogenous money, I think he very much goes back to his early period in which, he is aware of accommodation. Here he's a lot more aware of it. And he says endogenous money, certainly a possibility, but he sees that as a choice of central banks. It's a policy choice. Central banks must allow money to be endogenous. And here you see very much sort of the evolutionary view that I talked about in my paper with Sergio Rossi. Basil sees endogenous money as a policy choice of central banks. He says whether the money stock or interest rates are the optimum control instrument depends on the central bank. The degree to which the money supply is endogenous is a policy, rule. So this is not exactly endogenous money, but nevertheless, he's almost there. Now, let's be clear. Moore does not see endogenous money, as do the Secretists. For us, money's endogenous because it's very nature to debt. This is sort of very much in the same vein as the MMT. I think one of the best chapters on this was written by Randy in his, was it 1991 book? I think chapter 1, very good. Relationship with debt. And so this is what Secretists are about. Basil's view on endogenous money is not that. It's a policy decision that needs to be made by the central bank. But the paper is nonetheless important because I think it acts as a transition between his old Tobin views and what's to come later. But then, the 1972 paper is interesting, but then comes his 1973 book, another textbook that he writes. And this is a very confusing book. I think it's a step backwards. King describes it as very largely an orthodox Keynesian text, and I completely agree. Here, Basil talks clearly of the exogenous money supply. He draws it as vertical. He talks of central banks controlling reserves that influence bank lending. Banks are financial intermediaries. He talks about the reserve ratio, all of those conventional ideas, and so how can we explain this step backwards? Well, simply, I think the book was written by Basil's account in 1969, so before his Cambridge sabbatical. And I think that the book was too much into production to bring in any sort of substantive changes. So the book went out, got published as is. Um, I think that's the end of the story. Uh, I don't think we should see it as much as a step backward, but simply as, it would have required too much. It was either about killing the project or letting it go forward. And I think changes were not very feasible. So I think that explains the book. Now, during this period, in 1974, Basil writes a couple of papers actually, on Pazinetti. So he's definitely expanding his interest in heterodox economics. He's reading Kiletsky. So you can see the evolution happening, papers on 74, 75. So quite the progression in Basil's view. And then comes in 1977. I'm going to end in about 5 minutes. In 1978, he has another sabbatical at the Bank of England. And he becomes very good friends with Charles Goodhart, that he describes as my favorite real-world central banker, for his encouragement of my fumbling early attempts to develop the notion of monetary endogeneity. So Basil recognizes this long struggle of escape, which he describes as fumbling early attempts. And of course, ironically, Charles ended up writing a paper called "Has More Become Too Horizontal?" I don't think there is such a thing as too horizontal, by the way. So these early fumbling attempts, I think, are his, 1972, 73 views. But he claims to have clearly come around to the view of endogenous money after the central bank period. And this corresponds to 1978, a paper and challenge that are talked about on monetary factors, which was reprinted in Eichner's book. So I think, yes, I think here what is interesting is that all these elements that were before in his work, the importance of banks, the credit-led demand for credit, the credit worthiness, all of these elements are still here, but except what he gets rid of is the supply constraint. And here finally he sees assets running to liabilities. He rejects the money multiplier model and all of the orthodox notions of reserves and etc. And here central banks no longer chooses about letting money being endogenous or not. Here the supportive responsibilities of the central bank are much more important than controlling the money supply. Central banks must ensure the stability, and this is why they must be accommodative. And so, I mean, in a way, it's sort of not exactly a circulationist view of endogenous money, but it's clearly an evolutionary view. But these are the views that would stay with him now from moving forward with his papers and his debates in the 80s about the that he had with people like Tom Pally and Bob Poland, where both of them argued in terms of bicausal relationships when it comes to reserves. Basil was clear that reserves didn't play a role, that central banks had no choice but to be accommodative. So, in conclusion, and I was given 30 minutes, and here I am. In conclusion, Basil the horizontalist didn't happen overnight. It was a very long span of almost 30 years or so, or 20 or to 30 years. And it was the result of a historical accident, so to speak, for which we've all gained from. But Basil's presence in Cambridge at the time where Paul was there, and in an office that was between Jones and Paul's, all sort of led to Basil being exposed to post-Keynesian ideas. I don't think he might have been otherwise. And I think history is funny that way. And so from there on, Basil became the post-Keynesian that we all know. Thank you very much.